خنفرا نمفيوت نمبشيري نمبيبنما إثواب ونوتي أن أوت أمين. Why must a Coptic Orthodox Christian learn Coptic language for his worship, his service, and his spirituality? Have you ever noticed that in the name Coptic Orthodox Church there is the word Coptic? Then, can you be Orthodox without being Coptic? Can you be Coptic without knowing almost anything about Coptic language? These questions you have to ask them to yourself. I would like to mention a biblical verse in Zephaniah 3:9 from the Coptic Bible. Tinatasto en ulas etevgenea, ejen hanlaus esrutob emifran emipchois, enje awen niven esu ervok naf, gen unahvef en uot. I will convert a tongue for his generation upon the peoples, so that everyone may entreat to the name of the Lord, to serve him under one yoke. This verse is mentioning one tongue, one language, to unify the people of the Lord. And as Coptic Orthodox Christians, we can understand that this verse can suggest the unity by the liturgical language, the language that we use to transmit the Bible, to transmit the sacraments, and to pray and to do the divine liturgy. This liturgy is making the Pisoma in Tepe Christos, the body of the Lord, by the divine Eucharistia, the divine Eucharist. So we can understand that the language of the liturgy is a way for the unity, a way to the unity. Coptic is traditionally called the language of angels. Four main Coptic Orthodox saints and writers, mainly bishops, by the way, and the popes, deplored the loss of the Coptic language. First, Saint Samuel, the confessor of Karamun, and we will quote a passage of the Apocalypse of Saint Samuel. Second, Sawirus ibn al-Muqaffa, a theologian. Third, Athanasius of Kos, which is later on, and later on again, further, Saint Cyril VI, who also encouraged his disciples to pray personally in Coptic, to recite the Psalms in Coptic, and to read the Bible in Coptic. In one of his letters, he said, "I hope that you persevere in reading the Holy Scriptures, and I hope that you read them in Coptic." It's from the letter, a personal letter of Saint Cyril VI. So we have saint people mentioning the use of Coptic language to draw near to God and to receive the tradition of the Church and develop our spirituality. Now we will develop the example of the Apocalypse of Saint Samuel the Confessor, which is from the 8th century. Woe upon woe. What shall I say, my children, about those times and about the great idleness that will overtake the Christians? At that time they will move away from uprightness and start to assimilate themselves to the Hagarines, that is to say the Arab conquerors, in their actions. They will give their names to their children, discarding the names of the angels, the prophets, the apostles, and the martyrs. They will also do something else, which, if I were to tell you of it, would greatly pain your hearts. They will abandon the beautiful Coptic language, in which the Holy Spirit has often spoken through the mouth of our spiritual fathers. They will teach their children from an early age to speak the Arabic language of the Bedouin, and will take pride in it. They will take pride in it. He is mentioning here, suggesting that the Coptic Arabic-speaking people will take pride in speaking the Arabic language more than the Coptic language. I continue. Even the priests and the monks, they too will dare to speak in Arabic and to take pride in it, and that within the sanctuary.
Woe upon woe.
Oh, my dear children, what shall I say? At that time the readers in the church will no longer understand what they read nor what they say, because they will have forgotten their language, and they will truly be miserable and deserving to be wept over, because they will have forgotten their language and will speak the Arabic language of the Agagarenes. But woe to every Christian who teaches his son the Arabic language of the Agagarenes from an early age, causing him to forget the language of his fathers. Many books of the church shall fall into disuse, because there shall be nobody among them to take care of the books, their hearts being attracted by the Arabic books. And you can see here that Saint Samuel the Confessor, he is not mentioning Islamic books, he is mentioning Arabic books. That means that the problem is not the religion, the problem is the language. And the language is driving people near something and away of something. Now, Sawiros ibn al-Muqaffa, in the foreword of an 11th century Arabic treatise entitled The Book of Illumination, attributed to Sawiros ibn al-Muqaffa, the author points to the increasing difficulty to speak about the theologomenon, that is to say, the theological teaching of the Divine Trinity. I quote, "I tell you that the reason for the concealment of this mystery, the Trinity, from the Christian believers at this time is their mingling with the Hunafa, that is to say, the Muslims, and the disappearance of their Coptic language, through which they know the truth of their religion. We could say, through which they had to know the truth of their religion. The Coptic language through which they had or they have to know the truth of their religion. It has to come to be that the case that they do not hear any mention of the Son of God except in a metaphorical sense. Instead, most of what they hear is that God is Fard, unique, as Ahmad, eternal, and the rest of the language of that those of the Hunafa use. The Christian believers have become accustomed to this and have been raised with it, so that the mention of the Son of God has come to be difficult for them. They do not know any interpretation or meaning for it." Here, Sawiros ibn al-Muqaffa is mentioning the important idea that the loss of the Coptic language is the loss of the good interpretation of the Christian doctrines, the Christian dogmas, the Christian mysteries, the Christian theology. So here he's not suggesting to translate in Arabic all the theology, in Arabic Christian theology. No, he's mentioning the fact that the loss of the Coptic language is a loss of the comprehension, of the understanding of the Christian truth. It's very important to understand, because we can suggest that without the knowledge of the Coptic language, the Christian doesn't have at most the perfect idea of the Christian teachings of the church, of the Coptic church. And further, Athanasius of Qus. In the 14th century, Athanasius of Qus, the author of Qiladat al-Tahrir fi ilm al-Tafsir, Necklace of the Writing and Art of the Translation, already looks back at the shift from Coptic to Arabic. In his presentation, the loss of Coptic was a kind of malheur, woe, misfortune, a catastrophe, within the totality of the divine language economy. Later on, Athanasius writes that the Egyptians have forgotten their language and it's very difficult for them to learn it. I quote this from an article of a specialist who is Richter. Now, away from the specialist, I will mention a reaction of a man who is Coptic Orthodox, but who is French-born. He's not Egyptian at all. He's not Egyptian. He's Coptic Orthodox since decades. Deacon. He's deacon in the church, and very dedicated to his mission of deacon. He's not speaking Arabic. He's Coptic. And he says he visits a lot of Coptic church, Egyptian speaking churches in the Western countries, in Europe especially. And his reaction is very spontaneous, very natural, and his reaction is this: why do the Copts abroad still use Arabic language? It's a question. It's a question. Why do the Copts abroad continue to use Arabic language? That is to say, they were forced to use it in the past only by oppression of the Muslim invaders. They were forced. It's a language by force. Why don't they try to get freed from this imposed language as soon as they find an opportunity to do so? The Egyptians have to understand that for any non-Egyptian Orthodox, the use of Arabic language in the church and for liturgies, especially abroad Egypt, outside Egypt, means continuing to accept being oppressed by Muslim invaders in a way that is no longer justified. Okay? So it's a point that needs to be meditated, to be thought about. In this lecture, I will demonstrate that it's necessary to learn Coptic as much as possible, and therefore examine all the arguments of all those who say that it's useless or not necessary at all to learn Coptic. And this in order to leave nothing to change in what is said on this subject, and to cut short everything that prevents Copts from learning their language. And there is work to be done on this point, once and for all. Indeed, Coptic is the sacred language of our Coptic Orthodox faith, and it's appropriate for any Orthodox Christian who has the opportunity to learn this sanctified language. First question: when and how the Coptic Orthodox Church started to tolerate the use of a vernacular non-Christian language in the church. Vernacular means a daily language outside of the church and outside of any language used by the Holy Fathers. The Holy Fathers, they used Aramaic, maybe in the beginning, but there is no text in Aramaic. And then mainly Greek. That's why we have a lot of Greek in the Coptic liturgy. And for our Holy Fathers in Egypt, starting from Abba Antonios, who was a Copt, who was speaking Coptic. So when the Coptic Church started to tolerate the use of a vernacular non-Christian language in the church, that is Arabic, and then outside English and all European languages, for example, but starting from with Arabic. Gabriel II, Pope of Alexandria, Coptic Orthodox Pope in the 12th century, in the third canon of his 32 canons, he said, I quote, Every bishop among you, or bishops, must instruct the people in his charge and make obligatory for them the memorization of the doxology, and the prayer that the Lord Christ taught his disciples, and the Holy Confession in the language that they know and understand. So it meant at that time the vernacular language, the language that they know and understand. So Arabic, for Arabized people, it's Arabic language. To pray in this language and not to mumble words that they don't understand. So it was very important for the Pope Gabriel II to to pray in the language that we understand. That is to say, either you use Coptic language but you study it and you understand it, either or you use Arabic language for Arabic speaking people. Totally. You don't mumble words that you don't understand, according to Gabriel II. And whoever can do more than this, that is more than the vernacular language, so more than the Coptic language, more than the vernacular language is the Coptic language, will be rewarded. That means that there is a special reward, an extra reward for everyone, every Christian that will learn Coptic and practice the prayers in Coptic. It's an important precision because this canon is allowing the Coptic Orthodox Christians to pray in Arabic at that time, but he's giving a precision, giving an extra decision that every Christian learning Coptic and using Coptic will be rewarded more. So, at that time, starting from that time, the Arabic was started to be used in the church, but the church has kept parts in Greek and Coptic and has not entirely passed to Arabic, which means that the Arabic could not become the sacred language of the church, totally, but that it was necessary to keep as much as possible in Greek and Coptic. In this way, we see that at least part of the liturgies are practiced in Coptic and Greek, so that in some way the rest of the liturgy, said to be in the vernacular, is attached to the Coptic. The rest of the liturgy in Arabic is attached to the Coptic in some way, somehow, and thus linked to the Orthodoxy, a link which would be lost if everything were translated and not in Coptic. So this point is very important. The Coptic is the link that we need to keep with the Orthodox tradition. And if we can do more Coptic, we can reinforce this link to the Orthodoxy. So you have to ask yourself, do you want to reinforce, to be steadfast, more steadfast in the link to the Orthodoxy? It's a question that you have to ask yourself. Now I will develop this reflection. Why the Holy Coptic language allows us to approach God. One of the fundamental principles of the Orthodoxy is that we approach God only under certain conditions that we must fulfill in order to claim to approach God. Or we can say that in this way, to approach God, and especially for Him to approach us, which is the same movement, because we know in the theology that when we approach God, He approaches us. We must make the effort to fulfill certain prerequisites. To think that we approach God directly is therefore logically and a contrario, an error and an illusion. We will develop this point. This distinguishes us from Protestants, according to whom we approach God without any specific preparation or without making the effort to fulfill certain conditions. Because for them, for the Protestant, we must only have faith, and the grace of God does everything else directly and totally, which is of course false and for us an heresy. It's an heresy. We have to be very clear on this point. In our tradition, we practice some things because it's very useful and even maybe necessary to draw near God. Okay? It is a matter of making the individual available at several levels of the human person, including ritual preparations, for example, the fastings. Another example, at the level of the human life, baptism is a ritual condition to access the Eucharist. So we cannot have part in the communion of the Eucharist if we are not baptized. That means there are stages to pass before reaching, in particular, the Eucharist, which is the union with God, therefore the level of ultimate approach to God. This allows us to understand clearly that we must fulfill certain preparatory conditions to access God. These conditions, according to Orthodoxy, are of various orders and cover the three dimensions of the human: the spiritual, the mental or psychic, and the physical or corporeal. First, in the spiritual dimension, the dogmas, for example. The second, in the mental or psychic condition, the reconciled disposition, a moral purity. And third, in the physical or corporeal dimension, the fasting, the physical purity, for example. So these are conditions to draw near God and to draw near the communion and to take the Eucharist. Among these conditions of various orders, the Coptic language, which is the language of the transmission of our sacraments, and in particular the Divine Liturgy. So, using the Coptic language as much as possible is therefore a part of the preparatory conditions for approaching God. Just as we must fast as strictly as possible, be as morally pure as possible, have a precise, complete, and firm knowledge of dogmas as possible. Everything must be as much as possible. So the Coptic language is part of all these conditions because it's a part of the liturgy. So we need to master, to know the Coptic language as much as possible. Through Orthodox rites, we consecrate, that is to say, we make sacred, we sanctify some objects. Altar tablets, bread, wine, water, incense, utensils, icons, and human beings, for example, the priests. So why shouldn't a language be sacred in turn? On the contrary, if there is something other than Christians themselves that is very much consecrated, isn't it the language we use to transmit orthodoxy? We use that to perform our holy liturgies and to speak to God. We even realize that very often the rejection of Coptic as a sacred language goes hand in hand with an excessive attachment to Arabic, which is the language of another religion. This excessive attachment to Arabic appears as a form of sacralization of Arabic, totally unsuitable for Christian Orthodoxy. It's therefore urgent to return to Coptic, to reappropriate our own sacredness, our revelation, our tradition. There is another aspect of Orthodoxy, which is interesting. Let us listen to an argument from Protestants or atheists. Given that your God is unique and universal, why would he need us to sing hymns to him in Coptic and pray to him in Coptic during the Divine Liturgy in particular, since he is omnipotent, Pantocrator? He can therefore understand any language and universal. Being the God of all beings, he can understand the prayers of any being. God is everywhere and hears everything. He listens to our prayers wherever we are, at all times, in any language. So we have to answer this objection. And the answer is very simple. It's not for God in himself that we pray or sing in Coptic. In fact, it's for ourselves, to prepare ourselves to approach him, to try to make an effort to approach him. It's obvious that we do not learn Coptic because God understands Coptic better than French or English or Arabic. It is so that we ourselves have a different relationship with God. God does not does not need us to learn Coptic because God has no need at all. You can look at Psalms 50:16 and 49 verses 9 to 14. The Psalms insist on the idea that since God has no need for material sacrifice, the best sacrifice is praise. But in that verse, we understand that God will have favor upon some sacrifice when the heart is pure. So the sacrifice is not needed by God, but is accepted by God after we are pure enough for Him and that after we have made enough effort to draw near to Him. Therefore, God has no need at all, which does not mean that we should do nothing. Likewise, it's not because of the Coptic language is not a need of God that we should not learn it. And in that psalm, we see that the most important sacrifice is praise, like we say in the liturgy, sacrifice of praise. Thisia inesios. So our sacrifice is made of language. So the form of this sacrifice is important. If you read the Ancient Testament, the ancient Tidiasiki and Apas, we see that the manner, the method in which you prepare your sacrifice is very important for God. But our sacrifice is not material, is not an object. Our most important sacrifice is praise, thisia enesios. Thisia enesios, the sacrifice of praise, is made of language. What is the form of the language then? The form of the language, the best form, the best sacrifice that we can give to God, is the best language that we can learn for God. And the best language that we can learn for God in the Coptic Orthodox Church is Coptic. So if we want to give to God the best sacrifice, the best thisia enesios, the best sacrifice of praise, we should learn Coptic and pray in Coptic. So Orthodoxy does not consist in denying Protestant arguments or the potentially direct nature of our relationship with God. We can have a direct relationship with God, okay, but in showing that nothing is sufficient in itself, nothing is so simplistic. The Orthodox tradition consists in providing humans with various means to compensate for the deficit of their sinful nature, so that they can approach God by all possible means. Thus, direct prayers to God are not at all prohibited in Orthodoxy, but there is no problem practicing it. On the other hand, Orthodoxy consists in showing that this type of prayer, while useful and often legitimate, is not sufficient. Indeed, according to Orthodoxy, we must access the sacraments to fully approach God. This illustrates and demonstrates that a worship practice to draw us closer to God can be accepted, but that unlike Protestant, we do not risk affirming that it would be totally sufficient to draw us closer to God. It must be completed by a set of practices and rites that cover the various aspects of human existence and human nature, and the whole community of the Church. This allows human beings not to think of addressing God in a purely individualistic way by a simple mental activity of solitary prayer, for example. It can be useful, but, let us repeat, not sufficient. In this drawing, you can see that we can oppose Protestantism and the Coptic Orthodox Church, Copts. The Protestantism is characterized by two main items, two main features. First, there is no liturgical sacred language. It's very clear. The difference when you go in any church, Orthodox, Greek, Russian, Coptic. And when you enter a Protestant church, in the Protestant church, you will never have any liturgical language or sacred language. And there is no sacrament. You will have sacrament in the Orthodox Church. You will not have sacrament in the Protestant Church. You will have some practices who can remind some biblical episodes. So they remind the episodes of the Last Supper of the Lord. They don't do the Eucharist in itself. So now, if we look at the Copts, if the Copts are losing the Coptic language, they are drawing near the absence of liturgical language in the Protestantism. So every loss of the Coptic language is drawing near to the Protestantism and is at risk of losing the sacraments after this. Now there is another objection. To rely totally on an immediate means, such as individual mental prayer, which can be done anywhere and without any binding conditions, would lead to considering all the rest of our worship as totally useless theologically, and therefore without authority and relevance before God. No preparation, no conditions, but immediate contact with God by anyone. No need to learn Coptic, an old language that no one understands and which prevents us from speaking freely to God. What is the answer? As we said, God actually hears and understands everything, and at the same time, He does not even need us to express anything. If we follow this anti-Orthodox and anti-Coptic reasoning to its conclusion, we will arrive at the conclusion that there is therefore no need to pray at all. The Christ said, He knows your Father what you need, even before you ask Him. So He doesn't need you to express it. He doesn't need, because He knows it. If He knows it, He has everything to act. He has everything. He doesn't need you to express it, to learn it. So, should we stop praying? No, of course not. Protestants themselves, they pray. So they unconsciously recognize that it's necessary to fulfill conditions and practice rites to approach God, because the prayer is a rite anyway. But they do so in a chaotic, human, profane, and unconscious way, spontaneously, without theological coherence, scorning the tradition of the fathers who transmitted the gospel. For Protestants, the human, as such, therefore, has the right to access God directly. Hence, the practice of the vernacular language and the rejection of any liturgical language. While in Orthodoxy, we are more humble. We cannot think that we can access God directly and totally. In Orthodoxy, we understand that we must submit the various dimensions of our human being to various rites that allow us to approach God much more concretely and globally if we truly practice them. For example, Protestant, by following their tendency to defend that the human has nothing to prepare, reject the sacraments and reject the fastings also. It's therefore the individual who creates his own salvation by himself, by his simple individualistic prayer. He does not need the church, in fact. He does not need a priest. He does not need to receive spiritual instruction from people who have received the apostolic deposit. The Protestant Christian has no one above him and therefore believes himself capable of accessing God by himself, which obviously makes him run the risk of pride or illusion. We are not saying, of course, that the priest accesses God for the people, the Orthodox priest, for example, accesses God for the people who, for their part, do not access God, because it's not what the Orthodox theology of the Fathers means. On the contrary, the priest presents to God the prayer of the whole people, of which he is both a member and the authorized representative by priestly consecration, which is very different. So we have developed All this reasoning to show that something that exists in the rites of the Church has never been considered sufficient in itself, but is part of the elements of tradition that allow to complete a set of rites that cover all of human nature and make it globally capable of receiving the grace of God, of reuniting with God. The Coptic language is part of these ritual elements in the same way as fasting or as psalmody. We must therefore venerate the Coptic language in the same way as all the other ritual elements that all participate in preparing us to approach God in our worship, in our love for Him, which is expressed in worship, and in our desire to be reunited with Him, not only by mental pretension alone, but by an effort that concerns at the same time our body, like fasting, our soul, like moral purity, and our intellect, effort to learn the Coptic language. Now, some people say that it's too much difficult, and it's too for few people. And we answer by what said the Lord. I enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and spacious the way is the way that leads to destruction, and many there are who enter through it. How narrow is the gate, and constricted is the way that leads to life, and how few there are who find it. We must therefore focus on our efforts on all parts of our being, and our intellect is part of it. It's even one of the most precious gifts of God to allow us to understand Him, to access the lights of the Logos, of the faith, of the revelation, and of the mysteries. We must make efforts at all levels, including at the level of the language we use. Another common argument objection is that using the vernacular language is more sincere than doing so via a liturgical language like Coptic, which is off-putting to learn. The answer is it's also off-putting to fast or to follow demanding moral principles. For some, it's very off-putting to read the Bible or even to attend a service, even a Protestant one. We must therefore see things differently. What is difficult is an asceticism that is proposed to us as an opportunity to make an effort for Him, an effort for God, to purify ourselves, to draw closer to Him. Every difficult thing is an opportunity to do something for God Himself, for the spiritual tradition that has passed down through the generations, transmitting to us the light of the gospel. Another consequence of the Protestant way of thinking is that every Protestant is a pope, with the Bible in his hand. No intermediary, no authority, no hierarchy, no in-between. The Protestant faithful believes that he has direct access to divine revelation through the vernacular language of his version of the Bible, and he believes that he can speak directly to God individually. He has no need for a rite or an intermediary. He is Pope, he's like a Pope, he's his own Pope, the Pope of himself. Reading the Bible falls into the same category as what we said above about an incomplete practice. For example, spontaneous individual mental prayer is insufficient, but must be completed by the sacraments of the Church. Similarly, individual reading of the Bible in the vernacular language is not sufficient to access the totality of revelation, but must be completed by a study of the Holy Scripture according to the sacred texts transmitted by the Church, that is to say, the Bible in Coptic. In other words, reading the Bible in the vernacular language is only a preparatory step, useful but not sufficient. And the Orthodox Christian is the one who understands that this is not enough. He is humble and considers what he accomplishes individually as insufficient, necessary and useful, but insufficient in relation to the richness of the complete deposit of the Church, much richer and much more true than what the Christian in the vernacular can do alone, can do alone, can do alone, can do alone, can do alone. In some occasions, in some situations, there is a big meeting, a big convention with bishops, priests, and worshippers, Christians, Coptic Christians from several countries. For example, from Europe, from America, from a lot of countries abroad. And in that cases, sometimes they choose to make the prayers in the liturgy in the language of the country in which they dwell. For example, in England, from England, they do it in English. From France, they do it in French. From Germany, they do it in German, etc., etc. In that case, you can find some people, even some priests, that can say, we don't pray in Coptic, but in the language of our country, in the liturgy, because it's a testimony, a witnessing of, which is akin, which is like the Pentecost. Praying in all vernacular or these daily languages of these countries is like a Pentecost. Everybody speaking the language of the country in which they dwell, like a Pentecost. What can we answer to this remark, to this idea? In fact, no, it's not at all like Pentecost. Why? In the Bible, you have two examples of a multiplication of languages. There is the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel. The Babylonian confusion of languages. In the beginning, they speak one language, and after building the Tower of Babel, the Babel Tower, their languages split, and they cannot understand with each other because they speak a new language, a different language. And there is a multiplication of this language from a first situation where they speak one language. And in the New Testament, you have the Pentecost, where the disciples, the apostles and the disciples, they were speaking one language, maybe Aramaic or maybe Greek, and they began to speak language, a foreign language from abroad, Elamite, Babylonian, maybe Egyptian, maybe Armenian, maybe language from people that were visiting Jerusalem. Okay. But a Pentecost is a language given to spread the gospel to those who are ignorant of it, and not a language of transmission of the sacraments, of the prayers, and the Holy Orthodox scriptures. We use a vernacular language to speak outside of the Orthodoxy, to speak outside of the Church or outside of the Orthodoxy, for those who are almost ignorant of our faith and our practices and our tradition. But once we have entered Orthodoxy, Coptic, the Coptic Orthodoxy, Coptic language is our language, and it's Coptic that we must learn and practice to go back to the origin of our spiritual traditions. We must not confuse the Pentecost of the external evangelization and the language of spiritual and sacramental transmission. It's very different. The language of the spiritual and sacramental transmission must be a language, a united language, unifying language, and unique language. Because it's a language appointed to unify the church being the group of the worshippers, unified by Christ, unified by the church, by the tradition, and by the prayer. To be unified in the prayer, it's better to use one language. Another point. A homily must be a homily, for example, a homily during the divine liturgy. There is a homily by the priest or the bishop. A homily must naturally obviously be given in the vernacular language because all the communicant people must be able to understand it. To say that we must use only vernacular languages in our liturgies is therefore not at all a Pentecost, because Pentecost is the transmission of the message of the gospel to foreign non-Christian peoples belonging to multiple ethnicities, countries, languages, and religions, other religions, while the liturgy of the Church is the sign and the realization of the unity of the body of Christ. It's Coptic that unifies the Coptic Orthodox Church, and when we go to the Church, we search to be unified in Christ. To return to the Orthodox unity of our Church, we must therefore return to Coptic. We are not supposed to learn all foreign languages. On the other hand, we, servants of the Church, of the Coptic Church, we are all supposed to learn Coptic as soon as we have the opportunity. So, when we attend a meeting and a divine liturgy with different various bishops and priests of several countries, from Germany, Austria, Italy, France, England, United States, Canada, etc., we are not supposed to learn all these languages, English, German, Italian, French, etc., to attend the liturgy, to understand the liturgy. When we listen to the prayer, maybe there is a bishop or priest of Italia or Holland. We will not understand Holland, Dutch prayer, okay? We don't understand this prayer in Dutch. But we have to understand what is the liturgy when it is unified. And when it's unified by the Coptic language. We are not supposed to learn Dutch to be Christian, or Italian to be Christian, or German or French. But we are supposed to learn Coptic to be a good Coptic Orthodox Christian. So to say that all foreign languages should be used in liturgies, where several priests from Egyptian immigration in different countries participate, is fallacious. Because it means that the liturgy is said voluntarily in languages that other members of the Christian assembly will not understand anyway. Whereas, in the case of Coptic, was conceived as a language of unity, all are unified by Coptic, and as all the pious servants and faithful are supposed to learn it, they are unified by this language. We are not supposed to learn all the languages of the world. We are supposed to learn Coptic. So, praying in all languages is like Pentecost. This is called Pentecostalism, which is a Protestant heresy. We are not supposed to attend a divine liturgy with prayers from all the worlds so that we don't understand them, so that we don't understand the liturgy. And even the Pope Gabriel II, he blamed the use of languages that we don't understand in the liturgy. But if we have one language, it's Coptic, and we can, all of us, we can learn Coptic, and we can understand the original liturgy. So, that is why Coptic should be practiced in the church as much as possible, and if possible, only in Coptic. If we look at a verse of Paul, the Apostle Paul, we have a very interesting passage about languages. Brethren, do not become like children in your mind. On the contrary, in evil, we be babes, but in your mind, be perfect. In the law, it's written, with those of another tongue and with other lips will I speak to these people. And even so, they will not listen, declares the Lord. Therefore, languages, and we can understand here vernacular languages, should be a sign not to those who have faith, but those who have no faith. So to spread the gospel to those who have no faith, says the Apostle Paul. But on the contrary, prophecy, so the explanation of the doctrine in the sacred language, Coptic for us, the prophecy is not for those who have no faith, but for those who have faith, so baptized Orthodox Christians. In this passage, the Apostle Paul is explaining very clearly the difference of use of languages. Here, the languages of Pentecostal languages are a sign for those who have no faith. It's written by the Apostle Paul. So the Pentecostal, the languages, the gift of languages by the Holy Spirit in the Pentecost is a grace of God to spread the gospel and to speak to those who have no faith, who are not Christian. But the prophecy is the Coptic language. Here, prophecy, the noun used by, the word used by Paul, prophecy is the Bible. In the original language for us it's Coptic, the transmission of the original sacred liturgical language of the church is for those who have faith, so are baptized in the Orthodox faith. Now I would like to stress some point about the language and the difference between the use of languages. I will not develop these ideas, but I will mention them to enrich the reflection. And it's very useful to think about these ideas, to review in our minds the status of languages in our prayers, in our religious and spiritual practice. We have to take into account that a language is a vision of the world. Every language has a vision of the world. For example, the English is the language of institutions, worldly institutions, global institutions, NATO, every international institutions. Is the language of international affairs, international commerce, international exchanges, etc. So it's a language with a vision of the world, a globally merchant vision of the world, of the trade, global economy, etc. If you look at the French, for example, the French is a language of Descartes. It's the language of art and literature and the love of the beauty of the language, the love of the art, the literature, and also the reasoning like Descartes, to be like René Descartes, like to be very reasoning, very rational. Even more, the German language, it's also a vision of the world. The German language is the language of Nietzsche, of Hegel, of a lot of philosophers, famous, and also Goethe, a lot of philosophers from this kind. So Nietzsche, Hegel, Schopenhauer, a lot of German, and they are very rational, very structured, very. So it's a vision of the world. Behind the language, there is a vision, a manner to apprehend, to understand, to see the world, the life, the existence. So when you use a special language with his vision of the world to pray in the Coptic Orthodox Church, you are borrowing the vision of the world of this language. And it will influence your way to pray and to understand the Bible, to understand the liturgy, to understand the spiritual doctrine of the church. It will change it. It will influence. So if you use Arabic is a vision of the world. The vision of the world of Arabic language is totally influenced by Islam. So the vision of the world of Arabic language is strongly Islamic. But the other language of the earth is the same. They have the same problem. If you use Japanese, it will have Japanese element of the vision of the world. If you use Chinese, it will have etc. It will have a Chinese vision of the world. if you use maybe an Indian language from India, like Hindi, you will have this vision of the word linked to Hinduism, for example, etc. So we have to think about it. But if we use Coptic language, the Coptic language is the language with the vision of the word, which is exactly and originally the one of the Christ and the apostles and our holy fathers who transmitted the mysteries and the Bible and the liturgy in this language. Another point, Saint Samuel the Confessor told us that the Coptic language is a beautiful language. Why it is important? It's not beautiful to be an ornament of our culture. We have to understand that when we go to the church, we like it sometimes because we know that it will be beautiful. We like the beauty of the liturgy. It's beautiful, even if there is not much shamas, not much deacons, cantors, singers, even if it's not so magnificent. It's beautiful. The liturgy or the Coptic prayer is beautiful. Why? In fact, it's important because it's theologically important because we have to draw near to the beauty of God. God is beautiful. His mysteries are beautiful. And we need to be appealed by this beauty. It's normal that this beauty is appealing us, calling us to draw near, to draw close. Third, I don't develop more. Third, it's the language of the saints. I already spoke about this, but we need to think about it. If we want to live in the path, the heritage, the legacy of the saints of the Coptic Church, we need to go back to the Coptic language. And we will be heirs, we will be inheritance of this heritage. It's also a language for which martyrs died. They died for this language and for this faith. So if we use Coptic language, we become worthy of the worthy to be inheritance, to be heirs of this deposit for which our martyrs died. It's very important. They died for it. So if we don't care about it, we have a problem because they died for it. And fifth point, it's a language through which all the sacraments, the Holy Scriptures, and the spirituality of the Church have been transmitted. The rest, the translation in vernacular language, being only the translation, the simplification or the extension of the word of the Holy Scriptures or the liturgy. So doing everything in the vernacular and rejecting the sacred language will draw us close to the Protestantism, because there are no saints and there are no liturgical language like we saw. There is one objection. Another objection, Coptic is said to be translated from Greek. So some can say that why not accept that Arabic is also translated from Greek or from Coptic and Greek? So it would come from the same thing. So there is no special reason to go back to Coptic, because anyway it's a translation. In fact, when the Church fully adopted Coptic as the sacred Christian language, it was the successor in the use of the Egyptian language of the Ptolemaic Greco-Egyptian culture, and beyond that, of the Pharaonic culture. Then Coptic became an integrally and essentially Christian language. There is no pagan use of Coptic in any Coptic text found. It's different with Arabic. If we consider that the Coptic Christian people switched to Arabic after having used Coptic, Arabic is not the Coptic heritage. It's a language imposed by arms and administrative power. Even Greek did not have the same status as the Arabic, because the Greek culture never oppressed the Egyptian culture. In fact, the Greek dominance of Egypt were very admirative, and they were willing to merge with the Egyptian culture. Moreover, Greek was also a Christian language, because the whole Bible was written in Greek in Egypt. The Ancient Testament of the Septuaginta and the New Testament was fully composed, written, and transmitted in Greek in the first centuries. So Greek was the Christian language, and inherited from the high philosophical and theological culture of Alexandria in Egypt. So the Coptic is also the heir, the legacy of the Greek theological culture of Egypt. Christian Coptic is therefore the sole heir of Pharaonic and then Ptolemaic Egypt, while Arabic is a language that continues to be essentially Islamic. And even worldwide, Arabic remains a vehicle of Islamic culture and influence. An Arabic speaker is someone who inherits an Arab Islamic culture, a language formed on the first basis of the Quran. Coptic, on the contrary, is the universal language of the Coptic Church, regardless of the origin and the vernacular language of the country where the Coptic Christian lives. Another specialist wrote that the linguistic peculiarities of the Arabic Christian manuscripts at the end of the Middle Ages of the Copts are not different from those of the manuscripts of the Christians of Palestine, Syria, and Mesopotamia, and close to what can be found in medieval Muslim manuscripts as well. This conclusion of a study of a lot of Christian Arabic manuscripts of the Middle Ages proves two things. The transition, the language shift to Arabic completely loses the cultural and spiritual particularity of Christian Egypt, because this specialist is stressing the point that the Arabic Christian manuscripts have no linguistic, so no wording, no terminologic differences with Muslim manuscripts. And there is secondly an undeniable process of confusion with Islamic culture, Islamic thought, and Islamic worldview. So some people think that Arabic language has been Christianized. Now Arabic language can be Christian. In fact, linguistically speaking, it's wrong. Arabic is used in a Christian way by some Arabic-speaking Christians. It's very different. The Arabic language is not Christianized, but some Arabic-speaking people who are Christian use the Arabic language somehow in a Christian way. It's very different, but the language stays Islamic founded, Islamic structured. We can apply the reflection to our time and to modern language technology. For example, if you think about computers, computer science, applications, big data, and artificial intelligence. This is powered by the big data of all the texts available on the internet. Statistically, what is the share of the Arabic used by the Muslims and Arabic used by the Christians? I will use random numbers, but to say a proportion, like a proportion. but I think I am quite close to the truth. Maybe there is 95 or 98, 99% of Arabic texts on the web and on the world production of Arabic world production of texts are Muslim, and maybe 2%, 2 to 5% of Arabic production texts, Arabic text production, which are Christian. So when for example the AI uses this big data of Arabic texts, this big found of Arabic texts, either Muslim or Christian or neither religion, maybe not close to a religious topic, a small part of Arabic is used by Christian. So the fact that 98 or 95% of Arabic texts are Muslim produced implies that the practice of Arabic by AI will be deeply penetrated by Islam, Islamic connotations, or Islamic meanings from Islamic countries, Islamic way of thinking, Islamic concept, Islamic worldview. If we compare this to the Coptic language, the observation is clear and striking. Coptic is entirely only Christian. So you can do your choice. You choose Arabic, who is mostly a Muslim language, or you choose Coptic. Now I would like to make a point about the difference between rite and ceremony applied to the question of languages. There is some use of the vernacular language in the church and among the Christians. It's quite acceptable, but it's not. There is a difference to settle. There is a difference between rite and ceremony. The rite is linked more closely to the sacraments, to the Bible, more directly linked to the Bible, and all the sacraments, and the main festivals, the main rite, the main sacraments of the church. We call it rites. And there is ceremonies. Ceremony is some extensions to the rite, often imbued with popular culture, and it can be considered as like a descent, an ornament, a cultural development of liturgical theology into popular practices. And the vernacular language here is therefore legitimate and useful. It's very necessary to distinguish between the liturgical rite, especially the sacraments, and the ceremonies. They are complementary, but hierarchically distinct. For example, there is a difference between divine liturgy and taranim. So taranim are Arabic speaking and translated into English, into French, into other languages. But the divine liturgy, for the divine liturgy, the basic language must be Coptic, because it's a rite. But the ceremony, who are more linked to the people practice, can be applied, can be adapted to the popular language used by the community, the local community. So this distinction between rite and ceremony is very important and can guide us to an adaptation, balanced position about the sacred language. We use the sacred language, which is Coptic, for the rites, and we try to use it more and more for the rites, katai taxis, according to the model, the pure model of the Orthodoxy, and the spirit of the rite, the spirit of the sacrament, of the mysteries. And there is ceremonies, taranim, the songs that are important for us to reappropriate some popular practices and popular reappropriation of some spiritual meanings, cultural practices. So the effort, the asceticism, the vocation of Orthodox spiritual masters must reside in a sacrificial dedication. I would like to stress the point of humility, the asceticism, the effort that the Christians must do to draw close to God, and the spirit of sacrifice. In the Coptic Orthodox Church, we love to do some sacrifice for God, but one of the sacrifices that we can do, that we have to do, is a sacrifice on a linguistic base, because linguistic is part of the life. On every aspects, every items of the life, every elements of the life, of the human life, there is an effort to do. On money, on pleasures, on leisures, on holidays, on mental, our thoughts. We need to control our thoughts. We need to control our mouth, our tongue, our way to speak to people, our way to work at work, our way to deal with people, everything in the life, our clothing, our dressing, our makeup, everything is must be influenced by our Christian way of life. So the language is part of this, and we have to do an effort of asceticism to be more and more close to the Christian model. And the language in the field of the language, we have to do also an effort, and especially the masters, the priests, the monks, and the teachers in the Coptic Church, the Orthodox Church, must sacrifice certain things. For example, our preference for vernacular ease. And we have to work on humility. That's a point that was stressed by Amba Samuel Pio Homologitis, Saint Samuel the Confessor. They will be proud. They will be proud in their use of the Arabic language. So it means that there is a danger, a risk, to be proud of the Arabic allegedly Christian speaking, and forgot the Coptic language. But if we work on our humility, that means that we have to come back also to the Coptic language and to humiliate the Arabic speaking and every vernacular language. And we need this total abnegation of the individual, but also social, psychological, cultural, and even ethnic self for the benefit of a service to Christ through the framework of the Church, by the scrupulous observance of the spiritual deposit received, including the sacred language through which this deposit was received. Thus, the practice of Coptic by the Orthodox servant of God is part of the asceticism's efforts and spiritual exercises marking the abandonment of the worldly personality and the humble attachment to the pure tradition, spiritual tradition of the saints of the Church. So learning the Coptic language is part of the spiritual practices that the Coptic Orthodox Christians must be involved in. This effort of humility and work must be accomplished as soon as it is materially possible. Sometimes it's not possible. People are very poor, very busy because they have to work to give a living to their family, and they don't have any cultural opportunity to have time, to have access to books, to have access to teachers, maybe, to learn Coptic language. It's so much difficult, maybe during a certain period of their life at least. Okay, but for those whom it's materially possible and quite easy to make an effort to learn Coptic, they have to do it. They have absolutely to do it right now, as soon as it is materially possible, like every Christian has to do any asceticism as soon as he can do it. By learning Coptic, the Orthodox servant, like Christ, empties himself of his worldly personality. Okay, I'm Arabic speaking, I speak Arabic, Christian Arabic. I have to empty myself of this. I speak English, I speak French, I speak German, I am a Coptic Orthodox, I speak German, I am a German speaking teacher of the Coptic Orthodox Church, English speaking, French speaking, Italian speaking, Arabic speaking. I have to empty all this and I have to dedicate myself to Coptic language, because the Coptic is the language of the church, it's the language of our saints, it's the language of our liturgy, it's the language of our Bible, it's the language of our orthodoxy. And I accept to empty myself. I empty myself of this human identity, because these vernacular languages are human identity. The Coptic language is a divine, spiritual, angelic, saintly identity. It's very different. And these identities of the world languages, the vernacular languages, profane languages, are ultimately governed by the devil. It can be said that the use of Coptic, whenever possible, is a way to linguistically, it's on the field of linguistic. There is other fields of the life, yes. There is a moral field, relationship field, mental field, food field, okay. And there is also a linguistic field. And in this field, the devil's influence is for a worldly language. And especially in Egypt and in the worldly Coptic community, Arabic-speaking community, the devil's influence is making Arabic more and more important, and rejecting the Coptic language at the limits of the church. The vernacular language is imposed by men. The sacred and spiritual language of Coptic comes from God through his holy Orthodox servants and saints. Adopting the spiritual language as much as possible, therefore, means making the effort to escape human influences, the dominators who impose this language, and the language of another religion, the language of profane activities, to embrace a spiritual-based language who is Coptic language, in order to embrace the holy tradition transmitted by God and his holy servants and martyrs. Practicing the sacred Coptic language, therefore, means using an important element to, in our own way, to resist the devil by connecting more closely to our holy tradition. So, in this little table, we can oppose vernacular language, Arabic, English, every world language, who makes us closer to the world, and therefore closer to the prince of this world, that is the devil. And the sacred language, who allows us to get closer to God and his saints on the linguistic field. Like I said, somebody can think that the use of vernacular language must be forbidden according to me. No, but a hierarchy must be re-established. The concept of hierarchy is very important. It is absolutely fundamental in Orthodox doctrine. The hierarchy manifests itself at several levels. We know the hierarchy of the church: pope, bishops, priests, etc. There is a hierarchy among the saints. There is ranks, nitagma. For example, in the heathen, there is a hierarchy of the sacraments, and there is also a hierarchy of spiritual principles to be practiced in our life, a hierarchy and order of divine commandments. This principle also applies to languages. Our daily language is inferior and subordinate to the spiritual language. It must not supplant or dominate it, but the opposite is true. The sacred and spiritual language must supplant and dominate the word language of the daily life as much as possible. So we can say that Coptic should not accompany the vernacular language in our prayers, especially in church, but the opposite. The vernacular language is only there to accompany the true spiritual language, which is Coptic. It's not Coptic that accompanies the everyday language, it's the everyday language that accompanies Coptic. So it's the hierarchy. This is why we have spiritual reasons to learn Coptic, and not simply by love of linguistics, by love of study of ancient books or culture or national history. Coptic is not for academics who exhaust their energy in the study of old manuscripts. It's for Orthodox servants. On the contrary, it's up to the Orthodox Coptic servants to exhaust themselves learning Coptic, even more than non-Orthodox academics who only use it to have an academic career or a secular interest. We thank these academics for their researches, which are sometimes useful for the church, but we must regain the authority over the Coptic language, which is first and foremost that of the Orthodox Church and the spiritual transmission of our saints. A servant who learns Coptic is not a grammar aficionado who has a personal passion, a hobby. He is a pious servant who wants to approach the holy spiritual tradition of the Church, who wants to immerse himself in the original language of our sacraments and the teachings of our holy fathers. Now, about translations. There is some people who think that everything is translated, so now we don't need to do so much effort about Coptic because we have good translations. We have translations for everything. In the profane world, worldly activities, we can transpose profane notions. For example, refrigerator translates well because it designates a profane reality of an object existing in the same form in different countries. But we cannot transpose sacred notions. There is an Italian saying, traduttore traditore. Traduttore traditore. This Italian saying means translator, traitor, betrayer. That means that any translation betrays the original text, more or less. That is why a translation is useful for the sake of understanding and explaining to the people, but not enough and totally accurate for the precise Orthodox doctrine. We need to look at the original Orthodox text, which is the Coptic Bible. A translation never gives the full meaning of the original text completely. A translation is limited, reduced, and truncated. Some may object. There are several Coptic versions and there is no agreement on the standard Coptic text for the Church. This is a false objection and a false argument, since there is exactly the same problem with the original text of the New Testament in Greek or of the Old Testament in Hebrew and other languages. There are many variants in the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. For example, you can, for example, search for the end of the Gospel of Mark, which can be long or brief or without any ending. A translation, therefore, never transmits the entire meaning of the original text, but an image, a reflection of the basic text, a copy, a reproduction. It's therefore always desirable and honorable and spiritually profitable to get closer to the original state of prayer and liturgy. Another objection says that Coptic was not the language of Christ or the apostles, nor is it the language of today's Egyptian Christians, since very few Copts know Coptic language. Coptic had its importance for a time, but since it's not linked historically to Christ or the apostles, and since it's no longer our language, it became a dead language, we can abandon it and do everything in our prayers in the vernacular language. The answer is that just as Coptic must be learned as a spiritual language and not because it was the language spoken historically by Christ and the apostles, the language in which the Holy Testament was entirely transmitted was neither Aramaic nor Hebrew, but Greek. So the language in which the New Testament was written and transmitted was Greek and was not the language spoken by Christ and the apostles. On the same way, the Coptic language can be a spiritual language, but not the language historically spoken by Christ and the apostles. The spiritual and sacred language is not determined by historicist reasons, but by the principle of transmission by the Holy Fathers, which is very different. It's not important for spiritual reasons of divine and sacramental economy that we find the revelation of the New Testament in the language spoken historically by Jesus himself. Even the Apostle Paul did not speak Hebrew for some specialists, so he couldn't himself have understood the words of Jesus? No, of course. On the contrary, God used Greek in his perfect and omniscient divine economy to transmit the gospel through the instrument of his servants, the apostles, like our father Mark the evangelist. Now, Greek is preserved within Coptic, as evidenced by our liturgy, where we have preserved many things in Greek for this same reason, to preserve the link with the sacred language, and to sacralize Coptic. This sacred language chosen by the divine economy to transmit the Orthodox doctrine, the Orthodox text of the Holy Bible, and the Orthodox sacraments. Coptic is the faithful heir of this tradition because it constitutes the best channel to receive this Greek spiritual revelation and preserve it in Coptic, as evidenced by the preservation of many Greek words in Coptic, allowing to keep this link with the original terms. For example, monogenes, homoousios, trias, ios theos, theotokos, etc., without preventing them from being translated into Coptic. So it's Greek words in Coptic. So it's Greek and also Coptic words. The Coptic rite is a rite with a double heritage, which received the deposit of Hellenized Egypt, which allows it to receive the Greek New Testament as well as the entire Greek patristic tradition. To return to the passage from Hebrew to Greek, it must be understood that such a passage, this language shift, is never the result of a whim of a traditional transmitter, nor of a brutal historical shift, nor even, in general, of the choice of a founder of a tradition. In this matter, we must start from an extremely clear observation. There is strictly no Christian text in a Semitic language, for example Hebrew or Aramaic, which has been found even in manuscripts form or a pottery fragment in the first 2 centuries of our era. The only exception being the apocryphal Odes of Solomon, a short collection from the first half of the 2nd century, moreover of a mystical nature in the traditional sense, found in Syriac and partially in Greek. In fact, the entire corpus of Christian text from the first 2 centuries of Christianity is in Greek until the end of the 2nd century. On the other hand, the passage to Greek of Christianity has been prepared in advance by the almost complete Hellenization of the Old Testament and by many Jewish communities who already practiced their services in Greek before Christ, having abandoned Hebrew. On the contrary, Judaic Hebrew was formalized following a linguistic and graphic reconstruction by post-Christian rabbis and Masoretes. In other words, we can say that the language called Hebrew today is actually a post-Christian language, therefore necessarily anti-Christian, since it's based on a perpetuation of Judaism rejecting the Messiah Jesus. It is therefore absurd from this point of view to imagine that Hebrew constitutes a sacred language for Christianity, even though this was attempted by esotericists from the end of the Middle Ages, such as Reuchlin. But the fact that this was attempted by esotericists or mysticizing and Kabbalizing thinkers does not make it an orthodox path perfectly in accordance with the principles and coherent in itself. Thus, this passage into Greek has been prepared by the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, from our tradition and a Hellenized Jewish community in Egypt. Furthermore, we have to think about the difference and the link between the prayers of the priest at church and the answers of the deacons and the hymnology, the doxology, and the other hymns of the deacon. Sometimes, and in fact often, the priest in the Coptic Church says a prayer in Arabic or any vernacular language, and the deacons start a Coptic hymn, for example, the verses of the symbols. This is a theological problem, since the prayer of the priest is normally superior to the chant of the deacons, who depend on the prayer of the priest. However, Coptic cannot depend on Arabic, but the opposite corresponds to the hierarchy. Arabic depends on the Coptic. Here too, a hierarchy must be re-established, so that the Copt in the church has the position that suits him while allowing the use, if necessary, of a vernacular language when the full use of the sacred Coptic language is impossible, or would prevent the priest and the people from really participating in the sacraments. For example, if everything were done in Coptic abruptly in an ordinary parish, without them being warned or trained at all, many current faithful would react by saying that they are completely unable to follow the liturgy and really participate in it, which is of course to be taken into account. Switching to Coptic means making an effort before the Mass to prepare oneself to delve deeper into its original sacred language. This requires more personal preparation than just fasting, as all communicants do. Now, the spiritual benefits of using the Coptic language. Using our sacred Coptic language is to go back in time, in the good sense. It's to reconnect with the founding saints of the Church who lived in more spiritual times than we do. So it's to recognize that we are not as spiritual as they are, and that we must make a special effort to get closer to these examples of disciples of Christ. We know that fallen humanity is moving towards the worst, so human history, as it moves forward in time, is moving further and further away from God. Paul, the apostle, develops this idea very clearly throughout 2 Timothy 3. In the last days will be difficult times, for men will be lovers of themselves, but evil men will grow worse and worse, wandering and leading to error. But you continue in the discipline which you have learned and in which you have believed, knowing from whom you have learned it, and that from a child you have known the sacred writings, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith, which is in Christ Jesus. The sacred writings of which the Apostle Paul speaks is the Bible in Coptic. Why? Because we have to apply this verse to ourselves. When the Apostle Paul is not anymore speaking to Timothy. He's speaking to us. We are like Timothy and taught by the Apostle Paul and taught by our Holy Fathers, who are the successors of the Apostle Paul. So we have to think and to apply to ourselves the words of the Apostle Paul, knowing from whom you have learned it, and that from a child you have known the sacred writings. The sacred writings are the sacred writings in the form that the Coptic Orthodox Church gave it to us. And the Coptic Orthodox Church gave it in Coptic. So the sacred writings are the Bible in Coptic. Going back in time through the use and study of our sacred language makes us in some way conjure up part of this distance from God and holiness between us and the Coptic Orthodox saints of the past, their example and their founding teachings. So with this table you can see the difference between the sacred language of Coptic and the vernacular language. When we use the vernacular language, it's only for one main reason, that it is more easy to understand, so easy to use. But to go back to Coptic language, there is multiple strong theological reasons. Spiritual reasons, our relationship with God and His saints, understand more the spiritual life. Theological, to study and understand the Orthodox doctrine in a better and deeper way. Sacramental, to practice the Coptic prayer in the original language and understand it directly. Now we will conclude. Gustav Mahler, who was a famous composer, said, "Tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the transmission of fire." If we apply this to us, we need to understand that the Coptic language is not incomprehensible hymns that we perpetuate because it's our culture. It would be the worship of ashes. Our Coptic heritage, our Coptic legacy, the Coptic Bible, the Coptic liturgy, the Coptic hymnology, the Coptic prayers are a fire, a living fire, and must be a living fire. We must transmit this fire, the Coptic, the spiritual, liturgical, Christian Orthodox Coptic language. We do not say Arab Orthodox Church, we say Coptic Orthodox Church, so we need to be Coptic. That means that Coptic is Coptic language. The Coptic has a fundamental importance in the identity and Orthodox fidelity of the Church. As we saw, a language is a worldview. We need to have a Coptic worldview. Saint Samuel the Confessor said it's a beautiful language. We need to reflect the beauty of God by the beautiful Coptic language. It was the language of the saints, so we need to venerate these saints by using the Coptic language. It's a language for which our martyrs died, so we need to be worthy of these martyrdoms. Therefore, we must use Coptic in our prayers and in church whenever possible, and not doing so when possible means that we prefer to the easy way out, that we refuse to make an effort for God and for the tradition of the Church, for which our saints have made effort and sacrifices to transmit it. And we prefer a language that comes, in Egypt, from a tragic historical situation that we could improve or even ward off materially today. Using the sacred language of Coptic makes you pronounce the same words as your ancestors of the same tradition. It places you in a lineage that takes a form materialized by sound through verbal acts. Sacred language takes us out of the profane, everyday use of language. We need to be lifted in another field, another dimension of the life, which is superior to the daily dimension. Sacred language makes us think differently, since a language is also a thought. If we think differently than the daily life, when we pray, we will be lifted, elevated by this practice of Coptic prayer. So what can we do? We need to practice more Coptic in our prayers and doxologies. The vernacular language must help us to understand it, but not replace it. We need to learn parts of our fundamental prayers in Coptic and teach them to our children. For example, Jepeniot, our Father. We need to ask priests to practice more Coptic. We need to ask for a spiritual explanation of the Coptic liturgy and hymns from Orthodox servants of the Church. and not from individuals who do not have authorization from the church to do so. Individuals will tend to interpret the text of the church according to particular views, materialistic for example, and non-orthodox. It's difficult to find them. If it's difficult to find a consecrated servant of the church to teach you the Coptic meaning of the Coptic liturgy, you have to ask the church to train more, to consecrate more people competent in the Coptic, in the interpretation, the spiritual interpretation of Coptic language of the prayers and of the Bible, to be available and trained to answer the question of the worshippers on the Coptic liturgy in a spiritual consecration. We must not hesitate to ask the church for what the people need spiritually. We need to request entire liturgies in Coptic. We need to request Coptic lessons for our children at church. We need to request deacons and altar servers to give or request training at the church to recite and understand in Coptic parts of the liturgy and not only sing. هنفرع نبي فيوت نبي بشيري نبي بنما إثواب ونوتي إنو أوت أمين ونوتي إنو أوت أمين ونوتي إنو أوت أمين